Welcome. This is one of over 200 talks on the history of Western art. I have arranged the talks chronologically, starting with cave art through to art produced in the last few years. So there should be something here for everyone. And this particular talk is from section 18 on French Rococo art. And I'm illustrating this by looking at the work of just three of the main artists of the Rococo period: Antoine Watteau, François Boucher, and Jean-Honoré Fragonard. And this is a detail from Fragonard's The Swing of 1767, and it perfectly illustrates the Rococo style with its playful scenes of aristocratic leisure. I think the most important activity for aristocrats of this period was acquiring mistresses, and the most important activity for the women was disposing of their lovers. Let's begin with Jean-Antoine Watteau, and let me tell you about his life before we look at his work. He was born in Valenciennes, then part of the Spanish Netherlands. His father was a poor roof tiler, and so he began his life in hardship. Early biographers describe him as sensitive, moody, and when he was young he sketched street performers and devoured novels. At 18 he fled to Paris, where his first job involved churning out cheap devotional copies. He once boasted he could paint Gerrit Douw's Old Woman Praying with his eyes shut. He also painted cabinet-sized, melancholic and reflective military scenes. Following a quarrel with his mentor Claude Gillot, who specialised in commedia dell'arte scenes, he became a pupil of Claude Audran III, a decorator who dismissed Watteau's military paintings as frivolous. Nevertheless, undeterred, Watteau sold Return from the Campaign to a dealer for 60 livres, enough to fund a trip home, and on his return he quickly began to revolutionise French art. And in Paris, his pilgrimage to Cythera, which we'll see next, so baffled the Académie Royale that they had to invent a new category called Fête Galante to accommodate his dreamlike aristocrats flirting in lush gardens. Despite his fame, he remained a recluse. Friends called him continually sickened by what he was doing. He was a man who painted in action with ironic brilliance. His patron, Pierre Crozat, housed him in Paris, and he avoided all social obligations. He once quipped he was a libertine in spirit, but prudent in morals. Now, most of his life he was consumptive, that is, he had tuberculosis, and he sought London's air in 1719, only to find more admirers in London, like Dr. Mead, who fuelled his British acclaim. He died at just 36, leaving shop signs like L'Enseigne de Gersaint, the Gersaint sign, a witty farewell to Parisian consumerism. His legacy? He rejected the previously fashionable history and action paintings to capture that era's fragile elegance, where every silk gown seemed to hide a sigh. He created a new and influential genre, as I mentioned, the Fête Galante, and he infused French painting with a new sensibility, wistful, lyrical, and psychologically nuanced, and he infused Rococo's surface frivolity with an underlying melancholy. So let's look at his work. This is the work I mentioned, Pilgrimage to Cythera, sometimes called the Embarkation for Cythera. If you ever wondered what the Rococo era looked like in its earlier shimmering stage, look at this work. He painted it in 1717, and it's both a masterpiece and a milestone. It was, in fact, his reception piece for the Académie Royale. And as it wasn't a historical or religious scene, and it wasn't a portrait, and they so admired the work that the Academy invented a new category, as I said, the Fête Galante, literally a courtship party. That is, it's an elegant social gathering in a pastoral setting, showing amorous interactions between aristocrats. So Watteau got his own genre. Not many artists can say that. And by the time he painted this, he was living in Paris. It moved there from Valenciennes, his Flemish hometown, about 1702. He wasn't married. There's in fact no record of any long-term romantic relationship. He was melancholic. He was frequently ill, as I said, suffering from tuberculosis, and had a relatively short life. His work was dreamy, almost theatrical. And what we see here are elegantly dressed couples either arriving at or leaving the island of Cythera, which is the birthplace or the fabled birthplace of Aphrodite. And there's an ambiguity here. Are these couples coming or going? And that's part of, I think, of the charm of the work. If you look closely, you'll see the couples arranged on a loose diagonal, moving from flirtation to intimacy to departure, representing the various aspects of courtly love. On the right is a statue of Aphrodite, that's the Roman Venus, next to a seated couple. They are whispering to each other, suggesting the beginning of a courtship. The standing couple next to them there's a couple that are rising and then a standing couple who are walking off as if they're sharing a life of love together. And then finally they walk down the hill arm in arm and approach the boat, which is surrounded by cherubs, as they reach the end of their romantic journey. It sparkles with a soft light, warm colours, flickering brushwork, as though the whole thing might dissolve away if you look at it. There's a lot of symbolism: roses for love, the statue of Aphrodite to signal divine desire, and of course the boat, the symbol of the lover's passage, maybe into love, maybe away from love. So some people argue it's a work of wistful farewell. Now, Watteau reportedly based some of the figures here on actual actors from the Comédie Italienne with whom he had connections. He loved the Comédie Italienne. It was a mixture of theatre and painting, fantasy and longing, and it became his signature style. And although he died at just 36, the work he produced lit the path for Boucher and Fragonard and many other Rococo artists who came later. This is Fêtes Vénitiennes, or Venetian festivals. It's a jewel of a painting, small, brimming with elegance, movement, and that sort of ambiguous mood that Watteau mastered like no one else. It was painted in 1718, 1719, just a couple of years before his death, and it captures a kind of enchanted moment. There's a costume couple dancing, others look on, or flirt, or simply drift into reverie. It's as much a painting about silence and glances as it is of music and motion. By this point, Watteau was back in Paris. His health was suffering from a steep decline. He was being looked after by a friend, Abbé Haringer. But even though he was fading away physically, his brush remained full of life. And this work shows him at the height of his poetic power. The title, by the way, isn't original. It was likely added in the 19th century to evoke the masquerade balls of Venice. But this isn't Venice. It's a fantasy. It's a Parisian dream of Italy, full of powdered wigs and satins and flirtation. From the front left and centre, we see a dancing couple. The woman is now believed to be Ninon de L'Enclos, a celebrated beauty and salonière, or at least she was a theatrical stand-in for her. The man in the black hat may well be Nicolas Vleugels, a fellow painter and a friend of Watteau. So it could be a double portrait dressed up as a comédie dell'arte. And in the background on the right, there's a musician, possibly Watteau himself, playing a musette, which, as you can see, is a form of bagpipe played in aristocratic circles in the 17th and 18th centuries. Mezzotin. Watteau offers us a small but remarkably poignant study of unrequited love. Painted around 1718 to 19, it shows an eponymous comic servant character seated with a guitar, his eyes lifted up, not towards us, to someone behind him just out of sight. And it's that absence, I think, that implied presence of another, which gives it its emotional charge. Now, Mezzotin is a traditional buffoon, a minor character who we're meant to laugh at, but in Watteau's hands he's become something far more nuanced, a sensitive, frustrated, hopelessly in love character. Watteau's suggesting that his serenade is falling on deaf ears, or worse, he's being rebuffed. His slumped posture, he's barely touching the guitar strings, strained facial expression, it all suggests a performance interrupted by emotion, a portrait of disappointment. He was living in Paris at this time, increasingly reclusive, seriously ill with tuberculosis, still connected with the theatrical world, especially the Comédie Italienne. He often attended performance. He made studies of actors in costume. So this work may well have been inspired by one such performer, although we don't know who the model is. It's executed with his usual delicacy. The costumes, shimmers, silk and ruffles, rendered in soft brushwork and subtle colours. The background is deliberately neutral so that our attention is focused on the figure's emotional state rather than the surroundings. But you can see in the background there's the outline of a woman, perhaps he's the woman that he's hopelessly in love with. Another of Watteau's, perhaps one of his best known works, Pierrot, enigmatic, psychologically complex, painted near the end of his life. It stops you in your tracks. It's not just the size, it's a large painting. It's nearly 2 meters tall, which is unusually large for Watteau. He typically worked on small scale cabinet size. It's the figure that stops you in your tracks. Lanky, pale-faced, baggy white costume, staring directly out at us with a haunting, vulnerable blankness. There's no gesture. He's not performing. He just stands there, as if he's caught between acts or emotions. Who is he? Well, the painting was long mislabeled Guillet's, but we now know he's Pierrot, the sad clown from the Italian Commedia dell'arte. He's a theatrical stock character who's forever pining for love and forever ignored. So here's the thing, Watteau wasn't just depicting a role, he was elevating a figure of low comedy into high art. By the time at this time, he was living with his friend, as I said, Abbé Haringer, living at the Luxembourg Palace in Paris, where he'd eventually die. He probably painted this without a commission. It may have been a personal work, or perhaps for a close friend. Some people have even speculated that it might be a self-portrait. If you look closely at the background, you can see there's other figures from the Commedia dell'arte. Harlequin, Scaramouche, Columbine. They lounge and gesture behind Pierrot, but their antics look distant and irrelevant. He's not part of the joke anymore. He's dramatically lit, has a static posture, psychological depth. It isn't just Rococo whimsy, this painting. It's tragicomedy with a human face. Which brings us to his final work, L'Enseigne de Gersaint, the Gersaint sign. And it stands apart from his other work. It's not merely for its size, it's very large, or even for its ambition, but for its clarity of purpose. It was painted shortly before his death in 1720, and it's not for a salon or a royal patron, it's a shop sign for his friend Edmé François Gersaint, who was an art dealer on the Rue de Pont Notre Dame in Paris. And we see here the mastery of delicacy and illusion, and it's his final major work. It's a commercial sign, I think in itself a telling moment. It's not just a painting, it's a manifesto in disguise. Look at the painting more carefully. We see the shop, Gersaint's boutique. There's elegantly dressed clients. They browse paintings, they examine mirrors, negotiate taste. And on the left, the central motif is the packing away of a portrait of Louis XIV. It's a deliberate symbol. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had died in 1715 and is being gently boxed up, an era folded away with him. It's a quiet but unmistakable signal. The age of grandeur is passing, and a new generation of taste, leisure, and bourgeois collecting is dawning. So the painting, as you can see, is divided into two registers. On the left, art is being commodified. On the right, it's being admired. And this juxtaposition isn't intended to be cynical or celebratory. It's observational. Watteau, ever the ambivalent participant, seems both charmed and slightly dismayed by the world he shows us. He painted the whole painting in just a few days, although it was later trimmed at both ends, and it was never actually hung as a shop sign. I think it was regarded as too fine. Instead, it passed quickly into private collection and into legend as the painter's farewell. He'd been thin and delicate most of his life. He had consumption, a slow wasting disease, and died in 1721, aged just 36. So this painting, L'Enseigne de Gersaint, is more than an advertisement. It's Watteau's wry farewell, a scene crowded with symbols and references, framed in commerce and ending, as always with Watteau, in ambiguity. which brings us to François Boucher. Born in Paris to Nicolas Boucher, a lesser-known painter, François received his early training from his father before becoming an apprentice to the artist François Lemoyne and later to the engraver Jean-François Carr. But then in 1723, just when he was just 20, his career took off because he won the prestigious Prix de Rome. And although financial constraints meant he couldn't travel to Rome until 1728, he did eventually travel there when he was 25. And upon returning to Paris, he was admitted to the Académie Royale in 1731, and that endorsed him as an established artist. The painting on the left is believed to be a self-portrait painting when he was about 30, when he joined or was just about to join the Academy. And after he joined, he quickly rose through the ranks. He became professor, rector, and ultimately premier peintre de roi, first painter to the king in 1765. He painted mythological scenes, decorative allegories, pastoral landscapes, but reinvented them all for the Rococo era. He infused them all with elegance and eroticism. The portrait on the right is by Gustav Lundberg, and it was actually Lundberg's reception piece for the Academy. And this is the portrait that is often used to represent Boucher. He was 38 when it was painted. And by then, a major rising star in the Academy. He married Marie-Jeanne Bousseau in 1733, and they had 3 children. And the family was closely intertwined with his artistic career. His wife and children often served as models. The 2 daughters eventually married painters, and their son also pursued a career as an artist. It was his wife, by the way, Marie-Jeanne, who sometimes modelled for his more intimate works. His patrons included King Louis XV, Madame de Pompadour, and he produced designs for tapestries, porcelain, stage sets, and was director of the Gobelin tapestry factory. His style is characterised by delicate colours, sensuous forms, and playful subject matter. He was later criticised for superficiality, but his technical virtuosity and inventive compositions meant that he had a lasting legacy. He's the quintessential painter of the French Rococo, and here's a typical example of his work, the Rape of Europa, now in the Louvre. It's a large, spectacular display of mythological theatre. It was conceived with all the delicacy and sensuality that came to define the Rococo. It was painted around 1732 to 34, shortly after his return from Italy. He was cementing his place at the Académie Royale, and it shows his full command of both myth and mischief. Very different from Watteau. Gone is the melancholy, and in comes eroticism and fantasy. The story is from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It tells of Europa, who's a Phoenician princess, who is seduced by none other than Jupiter, king of the gods. And to seduce her, he transforms himself into a docile white bull. Once she climbs onto his back, delighted, intrigued, utterly unaware, he later plunges into the sea with her and abducts her to Crete, where she will become eventually the mother of the man-bull Minos. And in this version, Boucher's version, the drama is softened to become almost dreamlike. The bull looks up adoringly. Europa herself appears more flirtatious than fearful. Everything about this canvas signals spectacle, skimpy fabrics, rolling clouds, swooping putti, all provide a sense of movement. There's water foaming beneath, doves fluttering above, a delightful chaos around Europa's flowing limbs and diaphanous dress. Myth here is a pretext for visual and sensual indulgence. The semi-naked female figures become an important element of his later work, as we'll see. And at this time, Boucher was riding high. He had recently returned from Rome, as I said, and the experience in Rome left him technically accomplished, but utterly resistant to the austerity of classicism, the previous style. Instead, he embraced the fantastical and the erotic, and that aligns with the tastes of the court. The subject matter, of course, is ancient, but the painting is entirely of its moment, charming, provocative, painted with that unmistakable flair for sensual delight. Another painting by Boucher in the Louvre. This is Rinaldo and Armida, painted and displayed at the Salons of 1734. He was still, by this time, rising through the ranks of the French art world. And this painting was his reception piece at the Academy, and it secured his admission, established him as a master of mythological and literary painting with an unapologetically sensual touch. The subject itself is drawn from Tasso's epic poem, Jerusalem Delivered. It recounts the romantic entanglements of Christian knights during the First Crusade. And Rinaldo is one of those knights, a hero momentarily waylaid by the enchantress Armida, who was sent to seduce the knights. Here, Boucher has captured the lovers at the most deliciously theatrical moment. Armida, having seduced her intended victim, gazed at him with tender triumph. Rinaldo, one of the Christian army's greatest warriors, has been captivated by her charms, and she transports him to a magical island paradise, where she then falls in love with him. So the air here is thick with seduction, indulgence, perfume, silk and suggestion. Boucher, by this time in his early 30s, was known for his virtuoso brushwork and his gleeful embrace of Rococo opulence. The textures shimmer, the satin, the marble, the drowsy flesh. The palette is alive with pale blues, warm pinks and golden creams. The eroticism is visual. Now, when he was in Rome, he studied the Italian Baroque masters like Caravaggio and Cortona, but he absorbed the fluid grace of Tiepolo. But this painting is thoroughly French in tone, refined, decorative, entirely focused on pleasure. The narrative here is secondary to mood, seduction and display. It was a triumph at the Salon. It confirmed his reputation as the poet-painter of sensuality. And it was decades later, Madame de Pompadour would make him her favourite artist. But even here, at the beginning of his career, we can see that lifelong flirtation between myth and flesh. And in the Triumph of Venus, painted in 1740, he gives us not so much a mythological narrative as a vision of unbridled sensuality. It floats in a sea of silk, foam and rosy flesh. It was commissioned during the peak of his career. It's now in the National Museum of Sweden in Stockholm. And the luminous canvas shows the goddess Venus rising from the waves, surrounded by a gleaming retinue of tritons, nereids, doves, dolphins and cherubs, each one caressing, presenting or admiring her. This, of course, is not the Venus of solemn antiquity. It's a confection of 18th century fantasy. She's pink-cheeked, coyly modest, and intended to be utterly irresistible to the contemporary viewers. She's sitting on a seashell like a creamy centerpiece, borne aloft by the waves. The figures are entangled in this delightful chaos of limbs and draperies. Now, by 1740, when it was painted, he was, by that stage, the leading painter of the Rococo. He had royal commissions. He had a growing list of aristocratic patrons. He wasn't yet the premier peintre de roi, the king's painter, but he was already Madame de Pompadour's favourite. And he was the very embodiment of Parisian taste. And this painting, although it wasn't a commission by the court, it does reflect the fashionable appetite for erotic allegory dressed up in mythological finery. There's actually a twin of this painting, another version attributed to Boucher in the Wallace collection in London, but this version in Stockholm is generally thought to be the original. This is Boucher's interpretation of Leda and the Swan, an embodiment of Rococo style, opulent, sensual, unabashedly erotic. It's in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and it illustrates the myth of Leda, a mortal princess who is seduced again by Jupiter, this time not a bull, but in the guise of a swan. And the story is told by Ovid in his Metamorphoses, and it's ripe with symbolism, and Boucher interprets it with all the playfulness and charm of the Rococo period. The scene is framed by lush, undulating drapery, soft pastel colours, bathed in golden light. Now Leda, as you can see, is surprised by the swan as it thrusts towards her. The swan, as I said, is Jupiter in disguise. And by 1742, Boucher had become the darling of the French court and the preferred artist of Madame de Pompadour, the king's mistress. Now, the paintings like this were less about moral weight of the stories, more about creating an atmosphere of sensual pleasure. There's little suggestion of violence or coercion. It's all about beauty of the figures, indulgent eroticism, and turning the myth into an elegant fantasy. This is Diana leaving her bath, painted the same year, 1742, another typical work at the height of his powers and the peak of his taste for refined eroticism. Also in the Louvre, it's a smaller painting, and it shows the goddess Diana in a moment of private vulnerability, just after bathing, unconcerned by mortal modesty. It's a mythological pretext, of course, but one aimed firmly at the interests and desires of the court. Diana, goddess of the hunt and virgin protector of chastity, is shown here with her traditional bow and arrows to one side, and as a reclining nude amid silk and drapery, attended by a nymph who is examining her small foot. There's little sign of divine distance here. Boucher is giving us not so much a goddess, but more a woman of flesh and softness. It wasn't a grand commission, likely intended for a private collector. It reflects his talent for reimagining myth in terms of 18th century court taste. He was, by this stage, much in demand, particularly among collectors who favoured sensual cabinet-sized work for intimate viewing. And this painting would have offered both titillation and intellectual alibi. A nude, yes, but divine, cultured, and framed in allegory. We come now to perhaps Boucher's most famous painting. It was voted as the 39th most famous painting in the world. And it very much epitomises French Rococo and its flirtation with eroticism and sensuality. Painted at the height of his career, he was by then the painter to the king in waiting. He wouldn't officially become painter to the king till 1765. This work coincided with his prolific output for Madame de Pompadour. Although not directly tied to her commission, Blonde Odalisque reflects his knack for blending the exotic with titillation. It masquerades as an exotic odalisque. An odalisque is a harem concubine. So it's a work that justifies its existence as a representation of the oriental and the exotic. But the blonde muse is probably a Parisian model, so it's a pseudo-orientalism. It's devoid of all authentic detail, and it typifies the Rococo love of fantasy over accuracy. Boucher's wife, Marie-Jeanne, and daughters, as I said, often modelled for such works. We don't know which works, but likely works like this. Although there's another possible model for the work I'll mention in a moment. Boucher liked these interiors. He once said nature was too green and badly lit. He preferred exotic interiors and these confections of peach-toned flesh and silk. We don't know what the critics thought at the time. There's no mention of this work specifically, but we do know by the 1750s his work was drawing polarized reactions. Patrons, of course, adored his graceful compositions, as one noted, but Enlightenment thinkers like Diderot later scorned them as frivolous. I said I'd mention another possible model. It's been identified as some as Marie-Louise O'Murphy, a 14 to 15-year-old Irish-French courtesan who became one of King Louis the 15th's mistresses. And this association stems primarily from Giacomo Casanova's anecdote in his memoirs, where he claimed to have commissioned a nude portrait of young O'Murphy, although some scholars debate the accuracy of his account. The provocative pose, the eroticism, reportedly caught Louis XV's attention, and it led him to summon O'Murphy to his secret brothel. There was no age of consent in France of that type, although rape, seduction and abduction were all criminal offences and were prosecuted. The first formal age of consent in France wasn't established until 1832, and the age was 11 years old. Which brings us to Jean-Honoré Fragonard, one of the most brilliant and exuberant painters of the French Rococo, famed for his theatrical compositions, painterly virtuosity, unashamed embrace of the sensuality and pleasure. He was born in Grasse in southern France. His family was of modest means. His father was a glove maker. He moved to Paris as a child, and there his artistic promise quickly became apparent. He was apprenticed initially to a notary, but he soon turned to painting. At the age of 18, he entered the studio of François Boucher, who at that time was the reigning master of French decorative painting. Now, Boucher initially found Fragonard's style too raw and passed him on to Jean-Baptiste Simon Chardin, a master of still life, before he eventually took him back again as a pupil once his technique had matured. And Fragonard in 1752 also won the prestigious Prix de Rome, and that granted him study at the French Academy in Rome, and he was there from 1756 to 1761. He absorbed not only the high Baroque drama of Tiepolo and Cortona, but the pastoral serenity of Claude Lorraine and the theatrical flair of Giovanni Battista Piazzetta. So when he returned to Paris, he enjoyed much success at the salons and was soon turning away official commissions in favour of private patrons, painting flirtatious, often erotic scenes for the aristocracy. And his most famous work, The Swing, The Stolen Kiss, and The Lock, embody his love of pleasure, secrecy, and ornamental elegance. I think above all, elegance. In 1769, he married Marie-Anne Gerard, who was also a painter. She was a painter of miniatures. They had one son, Alexandre Évariste Fragonard, who would also become an artist. They had a quiet domestic life. He continued to paint mythological, literary and genre scenes, and he was one of the most prolific artists of the 18th century, producing more than 550 paintings during his career, from which I've had to select just a few. And by the end of his career, he died in 1806, so the French Revolution dealt a blow to his career. His aristocratic clientele vanished, and the Rococo style fell abruptly out of favour. He later attempted to adapt to Neoclassicism, but the momentum of his career was lost and he died in 1806, largely forgotten. He was rediscovered in the 19th century and is now celebrated as a master of light, of movement, and of joyful theatrical paintings. This is an early painting by him, and it must be his most famous, and it must be one of the most famous paintings in the world. It's the very essence of Rococo. You can see a young woman being pushed on a swing by an elderly gentleman on the right, possibly her husband, while her young lover hides in the bushes on the left, looking up her dress. It's playfully erotic, frivolous, dynamic and theatrical, and the swinging motion creates a sense of movement and spontaneity, which is brought to a head by the shoe, the slipper that she flings from her foot. It's mischievous snapshot of pre-revolutionary France at its most decadent and flirtatious. By this time, Fragonard was back in Paris, having returned from Rome in the early 1760s. He wasn't yet married, That came a few years later, but he was very much in the thick of aristocratic society. The swing was a private commission. The original request was made by a nobleman who initially, rather cheekily, asked another artist, Gabriel Francois Doyen, to paint his mistress being pushed on a swing by a bishop, while he himself reclined in the bushes. Doyen perhaps wisely declined, but Fragonard took it on with gusto. But he didn't paint a bishop. He swapped the bishop for a cuckolded husband and added a level of exuberance that borders, I think, on the absurd. Look at the scene, a young woman airborne in a froth of pink satin, flying through a secret garden. Her shoe arcs off in mid-swing. A young man, allegedly hiding in the undergrowth, gazes up her skirt. Scandalous, yes, but full of charm. Every leaf is painted with a kind of feathery brushwork. It's almost too perfect positioning of the figures. The putty statues seem complicit in the naughtiness. It all adds up to this play acting, this sort of silly, aristocratic, erotic, romantic idea. There's a lot of symbolism. The slipper, sexual abandonment, the Cupid with a finger to its lips, secrecy, of course, the overgrown garden, nature untamed, passion unrestrained. It's a theatre of pleasure, frozen mid-performance. Now, for years, we didn't know who the lovers were, who modelled it, but some art historians now think the woman might be Marie-Louise O'Murphy again, but 15 years later, the woman who was once mistress to Louis XV that we just saw in François Boucher's painting Blonde Odalisque, although there's no firm proof of that. What we do know is that this painting scandalised and delighted in equal measure. It was too risque for the salon. It remained in private hands for decades, and today it's a Rococo icon, endlessly parodied, referenced, even animated by Disney, in Tangled and in Frozen, although in those Disney works there's no one looking up her skirt. Young Girl Reading, 1769, one of his most introspective works, a quiet moment, free from the usual Rococo playfulness, still imbued with warmth and charm. By this time, he'd recently married Marie-Anne Gérard, and maybe this painting reflects the influence of domestic life. Living in Paris, he was still popular, but his subject matter was beginning to shift from the theatrical and amorous towards something more intimate and reflective. This depicts a young woman dressed in a saffron yellow gown, entirely absorbed in a book. She reclines in profile, set against a soft neutral background that focuses attention on her figure and the act of reading. She's calm, perhaps faintly amused. Her world entirely inward. There's no flirtations here, no visual aids, asides, no cheeky symbolism. It's a moment of concentration, affectionately observed. We don't know who the sitter is. Some think it could be one of his relatives, perhaps even his sister-in-law, Marguerite Gérard, who in fact trained under him and often modelled for his quieter scenes. You can see the brushwork is loose and confident, especially the dress and upholstery. The face is more precisely rendered. Unusually for Fragonard, it wasn't commissioned. It's thought to have been painted for pleasure, possibly part of a series. It's become one of his most beloved paintings. Its quiet dignity has found resonance far beyond its time, and today it's among the treasures of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The next painting is rather an abrupt change from this painting. At the time, Gimble or Jamble would have been viewed not as scandalous, but as refined and witty. Fragonard, known by then for the swing and other amorous scenes, was celebrated for his lively brushwork and deft storytelling. But by the 1770s, such Rococo frivolity was beginning to seem out of step. The world is becoming more morally serious and austere, heralded by the Enlightenment, and Jamble is both a peak and a swan song of a disappearing world. There are incidentally a number of versions of this painting which you might have seen. There's copies and engravings, and they vary. In summer, clothes vary. Some she feeds a dog a jamble, and the dog varies. The position and breed of the dog varies. By the way, a jamble is a ring-shaped biscuit from the south of France, not shown in this particular version. There was a version with the woman holding a biscuit out to the dog, which sold in 2024 at Christie's for $756,000. We don't know who the model is. She may have been a courtesan or actress. It's likely to have been a private commission intended for display in a boudoir or a collector's cabinet, not shown in a public space. The scene is ostensibly innocent, but it's rich in sexual overtones. The dog, although it was a common symbol of fidelity and affection, the imagery here implies sensuality and female indulgence, and the pastry, the jamble, is both an innocent biscuit and a suggestive symbol of sexual availability. This was painted in the early 1770s. It's the love letter, and it shows his ability to weave narrative, atmosphere and emotion into this single theatrical composition. His career was thriving. He had many patrons. This was almost certainly for a private collector. It captures the spirit of Rococo storytelling. There's a young woman seated at her toilette or writing desk, receives, or perhaps is just sending a letter. Her expression is enigmatic, a mixture of pleasure, anticipation, perhaps a touch of self-satisfaction. She's very richly dressed in luminous satin, surrounded by sumptuous furnishings, plush upholstery, heavy drapery, gilded surfaces, all painted with Fragonard's typical exuberant brushwork. But it's not just decorative, it's alive with narrative hints. The small dog, symbolising fidelity, peers out at us. One wonders whether it's a symbol of loyalty or an ironic counterpoint. A musical instrument lies on the floor, possibly alluding to a recently interrupted serenade. The sealed letter clutched in her hand, the look in her eyes suggest that she's arranging a secret liaison. One feels the painting is caught in the moment before something is about to happen, or just has. The Progress of Love, the Meeting. Now, this was part of a grand commission that turned into one of his most ironic career episodes. There were 4 panels created for Madame du Barry, mistress of Louis XV, all on the subject of the progress of love. And this is one of those, the meeting. It was intended to decorate her pavilion, which was a dreamy little chateau designed for pleasure and discretion. And Fragonard, who was then at the height of his fame, was considered the ideal choice. But tastes were changing. By the time the series was complete, Madame du Barry had cooled off the Rococo aesthetic and opted for something more restrained, commissioning two other artists, Joseph-Marie Vienne and Jean-Baptiste Marie Pierre, to replace Fragonard's panel. Stung by the rejection, he quietly retrieved his paintings and installed them years later in his cousin's villa in Grasse in the south of France, and there they remained, almost forgotten, until they were rediscovered in the 19th century. So what's going on here? It's a dynamic scene. There's a young man, sword at his side, rushing towards a young woman who awaits him under a statue of Venus, patroness of love. Their eyes lock, or his eyes have an intense emotional stare. Is it an elopement? Is it part theatrical romance? It's full of energy. Their sweeping gestures, lush greenery, painted in his fluid brushwork. The sculpture of Venus that presides over the encounter reinforces this theme of love sanctioned, or at least observed, by the gods. Today, this painting and the rest of the series is housed in the Frick collection in New York. This is a painting I mentioned earlier, The Stolen Kiss. We're now into the late 1780s. And by this time, Fragonard was an artist out of step with his times. The frivolous charm that had defined earlier Rococo was beginning to lose favour. France was teetering on the edge of revolution. Neoclassicism was the new order with its clean lines and moral seriousness. But in this shifting atmosphere, Fragonard produced one of his most refined and emotionally complex works, The Stolen Kiss. He'd retreated by this stage somewhat from the limelight. He was living still in Paris. He was still married and raising children. His work was in high demand amongst aristocratic patrons, but it was becoming increasingly unfashionable. He's returned here to a theme he knew well: love, secrecy, fleeting moments of intimacy, this time with a maturity and subtlety that distinguishes it from his early exuberance. There's a young woman, presumably in the middle of an evening gathering, stealing away from a room full of guests. As she turns a corner, her lover seizes the moment for a hurried kiss. Her body leans back, her arm outstretched as if resisting, yet her posture betrays only the thinnest veil of reluctance. The detail is exquisite, the silken folds of her gown, the opulence of the surroundings, the careful play of light on polished floor, rich drapery. There's no satyr in the bushes, no tumbling slipper. This is much quieter, more psychologically charged. But there is symbolism: the slightly ajar door, the clandestine gesture, the looming presence of unseen guests. It's all about risk, desire, and decorum balanced on a knife edge. In fact, the attribution of the work was uncertain for decades, and at times it was credited to Marguerite Gérard, his sister-in-law, and they sometimes did collaborate together. It's now believed to be by Fragonard. Which brings me to the final work, The Lock, one of Fragonard's most enigmatic and debated paintings, because it's in some ways romantic, dramatic, but also unsettling. It's painted around 1777-79, so it's late in his career. It was a time, as I said, when Rococo was beginning to give way to darker, more emotionally charged themes. He continued to paint for private collectors, but what do we see here? It's startling in its intimacy. There's a man, his face flushed and insistent. He reaches with one hand to bolt, or possibly unbolt, the bedroom door. The other pulls a young woman towards the bed, or towards him at least. She resists, at least partially. Her posture caught between surrender and protest. The lighting is theatrical, sharp chiaroscuro, creating a partly Caravaggio type intensity of chiaroscuro. There's a rumpled bed, spilled flowers, a dramatically dishevelled curtain, suggesting a moment just before or just after consummation. It's now in the Louvre. It's fairly small, 71 by 92 centimetres, but it radiates a psychological weight far beyond its modest scale. The ambiguity in the work has intrigued generations of viewers. Is it a consensual romantic tryst, or is this something darker? Fragonard never clarifies. There's a tension. That refusal to explain is part of its power, that ambiguity. It's thought to be part of a pair. The other work is The Wardrobe, another painting where the aftermath of a secret affair is shown. The two works are rarely displayed together. The erotic symbolism is unmistakable. The storyline remains elusive. I started with the swing and I end with the swing. I think it's the swing that embodies the frivolity of the Ancien Régime. When it was painted in 1767, there were already signs of social unrest. There was widespread poverty, rising bread prices, poor harvests, which led to frequent food riots. The food riots at that time weren't coordinated, and it wasn't an ideological uprising. It was people who were starving, seeking food. But it was, in other words, a direct response to hunger and injustice. But at that time, 1767, many peasants still regarded the king as a paternal figure who would step in and protect his people. However, that was being slowly eroded by the injustice, corruption and decadence of the court, the nobility, and even the clergy, which eventually led to the revolution of 1789. So that brings me to the end of this talk. I hope you'll continue to watch the series of talks, and it helps me if you subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support me by helping to increase my channel visibility. So thank you and goodbye for now.